In the heart of the American South during the 1950s and 1960s, the world seemed sharply divided along invisible yet deeply felt lines. Streets, schools, restaurants, and even public transportation carried the unmistakable mark of segregation, a system reinforced by Jim Crow laws and black codes that had been enacted decades earlier. For Black Americans, freedom from slavery did not equate to true liberty. They lived under constant scrutiny, their opportunities limited, their rights systematically denied. Everyday life was a careful negotiation, a balancing act between survival and the desire for dignity in a society that often refused to grant it. Imagine walking down a quiet southern street, the summer sun beating down, knowing that a simple act sitting on the wrong side of a bus, entering a whites-only store, or even daring to marry someone of a different race could change your life forever. This was the reality for countless Black Americans, who, despite the promises of emancipation nearly a century earlier, found themselves constrained by laws designed to enforce racial hierarchy, the fear of violence, social ostracism, and legal consequences permeated daily life, creating a culture where love, ambition, and dreams were often held hostage by prejudice. Within this rigid and oppressive environment, two young souls, Richard Loving, a white, and Mildred Jeter, a woman of African American and Native American descent, found themselves drawn to one another. Their connection was genuine, their feelings undeniable, yet their very love was considered a threat to the established social order. In Virginia, the law defined their union as illegal. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 prohibited marriages between white people and anyone with any trace of non-Caucasian ancestry, a rule that was not just legal but socially enforced by communities that believed racial purity must be protected at all costs. The story of Richard and Mildred is not just a tale of two individuals in love, it is a mirror reflecting a society grappling with its own prejudices. Their courage to follow their hearts, even in the face of possible arrest and exile, stands as a testament to the human desire for connection and equality. Their journey would eventually challenge deeply ingrained laws, confront systemic injustice, and spark a nationwide conversation about the meaning of freedom, justice, and civil rights. As we explore their story, we will uncover the history behind the laws that sought to control who could marry whom, the personal struggles faced by countless families, and the landmark legal battles that reshaped America. From the quiet corners of rural towns to the halls of the Supreme Court, Richard and Mildred's journey reminds us that love can be revolutionary, and that courage often begins with the simplest act of following your heart. If you enjoy stories that shine a light on hidden chapters of history and celebrate the triumph of human spirit over injustice, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By supporting us, you help bring more stories like this to life and ensure that the lessons of the past continue to inspire generations to come. Stay tuned as we dive into a story that changed the course of American history, one brave choice at a time. In the midst of a deeply divided society, where the boundaries of race dictated nearly every aspect of life, Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter's story began like a quiet ripple that would grow into a wave powerful enough to challenge the foundations of American law and society. Richard, a man of European descent, was raised in a modest rural community, his life shaped by the rhythms of farm work, local gatherings, and the familiar faces of neighbors who had lived side by side for generations. Mildred, in contrast, carried a rich heritage, a blend of African American and Native American ancestry that connected her to a history both resilient and complex, shaped by struggles that stretched back through the generations. Their paths crossed in a world where such a meeting was far from ordinary, in a region where laws and customs sought to keep people of different backgrounds separated, not only socially but legally. From the first moment their eyes met, there was a sense of recognition, a quiet understanding that defied the invisible walls erected by society. They shared laughter and dreams, discovered common values, and felt an unmistakable bond that transcended the divisions imposed upon them. It was not merely attraction or youthful infatuation. It was a connection that felt enduring, the kind that prompts a sense of belonging and a willingness to risk everything to be with one another. Yet the very notion of their union was illegal in Virginia, where the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 forbade marriage between white individuals and anyone with non-Caucasian ancestry. In the eyes of the law, their love was a violation, a threat to the rigid social hierarchy that had been carefully maintained for decades, reinforced by a combination of legal statutes, cultural norms, and a deeply ingrained belief in racial purity. Despite these barriers, Richard and Mildred's feelings continued to grow, their determination fueled by the understanding that love, by its very nature, should not be constrained by the narrow definitions of race or ancestry. They navigated the risks with courage, finding moments of quiet joy in a world that often sought to limit their freedom. Their relationship was a delicate dance of secrecy and bravery, of private affection and public caution, as they attempted to live authentically in a society determined to suppress what it could not control. In their shared laughter, their quiet conversations, and the simple acts of holding hands or walking together through the small towns of Virginia, they asserted their humanity in a world that frequently denied it. The decision to marry was not taken lightly. It was an act of defiance and hope, a declaration that their love mattered more than the fears of a society entrenched in prejudice. In 1958, they traveled to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal, and exchanged vows in a modest ceremony that marked the beginning of both their life together and the legal journey that would follow. Upon returning to their hometown, they were met not with acceptance, but with hostility. Neighbors, families, and local authorities treated them as if their very existence challenged the natural order. The Lovings were arrested in the dead of night, their home invaded by officers enforcing laws designed to prevent the union of people like them, and faced the choice of serving prison time or leaving the state for a period of years. Choosing exile over imprisonment, they moved to Washington, D.C., separated from their families and the land they had always called home, carrying with them only the certainty of their love and the hope that someday justice might prevail. While they adjusted to a new life in exile, the Lovings did not allow the injustice they had endured to define them. Their love became a quiet rebellion, a statement that human connection and compassion could not be legislated or suppressed. They raised their children with an awareness of both the beauty and the weight of their heritage, imparting lessons of dignity, courage, and the importance of standing up for one's beliefs. Their story would ultimately intersect with a broader struggle for civil rights, shining a light on the ways in which laws can perpetuate inequality and the capacity of ordinary people to challenge those laws through perseverance and moral clarity. The journey of Richard and Mildred Loving reminds us that the fight for justice often begins in the most personal of ways. It is the decision to love openly, to remain true to oneself, and to challenge societal norms when they conflict with fundamental human values. Their courage laid the groundwork for a Supreme Court case that would dismantle legal barriers to interracial marriage across the United States, proving that love, when combined with resilience and principle, has the power to reshape not just individual lives, but the course of history itself. Through their experiences, we see the intersection of personal devotion and legal transformation, a testament to the idea that meaningful change often starts with the quiet determination of people willing to defy injustice in pursuit of what is right. In reflecting on Richard and Mildred's story, we are invited to consider the broader implications of love constrained by prejudice and the ways in which ordinary lives can become catalysts for extraordinary societal change. Their union was not simply a marriage, it was a declaration of equality, a challenge to entrenched discrimination, and a beacon of hope for generations yet to come, reminding us that the courage to follow one's heart can illuminate paths toward justice that were once thought impossible. The love story of Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter, as brave and tender as it was, unfolded under the looming shadow of laws that sought to control the most intimate aspects of human life, dictating whom one could love and marry based solely on race. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was not just a piece of legislation. It was a reflection of a society obsessed with the maintenance of racial boundaries and the preservation of so-called purity. This law declared unequivocally that no white person could marry anyone who carried even the slightest trace of non-Caucasian ancestry, a definition that was both rigid and cruel, applied with meticulous scrutiny to prevent what lawmakers and social leaders deemed race mixing. For Richard and Mildred, the law transformed an ordinary human desire, love, companionship, the wish to build a life together, into a criminal act, making their bond not only socially controversial but legally punishable. The origins of the Racial Integrity Act were intertwined with a larger cultural and pseudo-scientific movement known as eugenics, which gained prominence in the early 20th century. Proponents of eugenics claimed that controlling reproduction and maintaining racial purity could improve society, a belief system that, in practice, led to systemic discrimination, forced sterilizations, and the regulation of intimate relationships. In Virginia, officials tasked with enforcing this law scrutinized families, inspected bloodlines, and imposed classifications that reduced complex human identities to legal categories. It was in this environment that the Lovings dared to imagine a future together, a future that the state deemed illegal simply because of the racial heritage of Mildred Jeter. Their love, in its simplest form, became a direct challenge to the machinery of oppression, a quiet act of defiance against centuries of laws designed to separate people and control bodies. When Richard and Mildred chose to marry in 1958, traveling to Washington, to circumvent Virginia's prohibitions, they were acutely aware of the danger that followed them home. Returning to Caroline County, they were not welcomed with open arms but confronted with the harsh reality of the law. Authorities arrested them, and the state presented a choice that starkly illustrated the cruelty of legal enforcement: serve a year in prison or leave Virginia for 25 years. Opting for exile over incarceration, the couple moved north, carrying with them the weight of a legal system that criminalized their very existence as a married couple. This forced relocation, painful and isolating as it was, also became the catalyst for a legal journey that would eventually challenge the entrenched structures of racial control across the entire nation. The case of the Lovings highlights not only the rigidity of Virginia's laws but also the broader societal forces that upheld them. While eugenics provided the supposed scientific justification, religion and tradition reinforced the social stigma surrounding interracial relationships. Many in the community, including local officials and clergy, viewed the Lovings union as an affront to morality and social order, a perspective rooted in decades of segregation and racial ideology. Yet, despite the fear of reprisal, the couple remained steadfast, demonstrating an extraordinary resilience that underscored the humanity behind their legal struggle. Every quiet evening they shared, every small gesture of normal life, became imbued with defiance, transforming the personal into the political and illuminating the absurdity and injustice of laws that attempted to control love itself. As the legal battle unfolded, it became evident that Virginia's Racial Integrity Act was more than an archaic relic. It was a direct assault on the basic rights of citizens to define their own families. The Lovings' decision to challenge the law was courageous not only because it involved personal risk, but because it exposed the arbitrary cruelty embedded within the legal system. Their fight took them from local courts to the highest levels of judicial scrutiny, revealing how legislation that masqueraded as protection for society actually perpetuated oppression, limited human freedom, and inflicted generational trauma. Every hearing, every appeal, was a testament to the endurance of ordinary people confronting systemic injustice, And the narrative of Richard and Mildred served as a powerful reminder of the intersection between law, culture, and personal courage. Through their struggle, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, once an instrument of control and oppression, became the focal point of a nationwide conversation about equality, human rights, and the role of law in regulating personal relationships. The Loving story illustrates how a single law, seemingly removed from daily life, can shape the destiny of individuals, families, and entire communities. Yet, it also reveals the profound impact that ordinary citizens can have when they confront injustice with dignity and determination. By refusing to accept that their love was a crime, Richard and Mildred forced a reckoning with laws that had long been taken for granted, ultimately paving the way for a Supreme Court decision that would declare such prohibitions unconstitutional and reaffirm the fundamental principle that love cannot be constrained by race. The narrative of the Lovings reminds us that legal systems, no matter how entrenched, are human constructs, subject to challenge and reform when they fail to uphold justice and equality. Their union, criminalized by the Racial Integrity Act, became a symbol of resistance, illustrating the transformative power of love and courage. In the end, the story is not merely about a law or a court case, but about the persistence of human connection, the moral imperative to resist unjust authority, and the enduring truth that the bonds we choose to honor define not only our personal lives, but the very fabric of society itself. Long before Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter faced the impossible choice of exile or imprisonment for their love, the United States had been entrenching racial divisions through law for nearly 3 centuries. Beginning in Maryland in 1691 with the passage of the first statute explicitly banning interracial marriage, this early law sought to regulate the most intimate human relationships, defining who could and could not unite in matrimony, and setting a precedent for a legal system increasingly invested in maintaining the racial hierarchy. Over the centuries, the pattern spread, growing in both scope and intensity, until by the late 1800s, 38 states had enacted similar prohibitions, each designed to prevent the mingling of races and to codify the notion that racial purity was not just a social expectation but a legal mandate. These statutes were not isolated rules. They were part of a web of laws and cultural practices that reinforced the belief that love, family, and personal choice were secondary to the perceived need to control society along racial lines. And they created an environment where human connections could be judged, constrained, and criminalized based on ancestry alone. For generations, these laws shaped the experiences of countless Americans, quietly dictating who could enter a home together, who could pass down a surname, and who could claim legitimacy in the eyes of the state. In small towns and large cities alike, the threat of legal and social repercussions hovered over relationships that dared to defy these rigid boundaries. Families were torn apart, communities were divided, and individuals lived with the constant awareness that their desires, feelings, and personal decisions could be subject to the scrutiny of neighbors, courts, and law enforcement officers. The legal framework was clear. To transgress these boundaries was to risk punishment, social exile, or public censure, and the long shadow of these statutes lingered even as the country changed in other ways, including the abolition of slavery and the gradual extension of civil rights. By the time Richard and Mildred fell in love, the legacy of these laws was deeply embedded in American society, creating an environment in which their very union was seen as a threat not only to the social order but to the moral fabric of their community. Virginia, like many states, had inherited and codified these prohibitions, most notably through the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which explicitly criminalized marriages between whites and anyone with non-Caucasian ancestry. Yet the roots of this law stretched back far beyond its formal passage. It was part of a continuum of legal restrictions, cultural beliefs, and pseudo-scientific ideologies that had defined racial boundaries for centuries. The Lovings' decision to marry, therefore, was not just a personal act of love, it was a challenge to an entire historical system that had sought to control human relationships along racial lines, a bold assertion of autonomy and dignity in the face of laws designed to deny both. The impact of these anti-miscegenation laws went beyond legal technicalities. They shaped the cultural imagination, influencing the ways communities perceived identity, morality, and propriety. Interracial couples were often ostracized, subjected to harassment, and treated as social pariahs, their relationships portrayed as unnatural or dangerous in local newspapers, sermons, and public discourse. These social pressures reinforced the legal prohibitions, creating a feedback loop in which law validated prejudice, and prejudice strengthened the law, leaving little room for personal freedom or the simple pursuit of happiness. In this context, the courage of Richard and Mildred stands out not merely because they loved one another, but because they dared to envision a life beyond the strictures imposed by centuries of discriminatory legislation, imagining a future where love was not a crime and families were not constrained by race. It is important to recognize that these laws were never static or isolated. They evolved alongside social anxieties, pseudo-scientific movements, and political agendas. In the early 20th century, the eugenics movement lent additional justification to the enforcement of anti-miscegenation statutes, promoting the idea that racial mixing would weaken the population and compromise genetic purity. Government agencies meticulously documented racial lineage, enforced segregation, and, in some cases, even authorized sterilization to prevent certain groups from reproducing. This convergence of law, science, and social ideology created a formidable barrier to interracial unions, one that Richard and Mildred confronted directly when they chose to marry in 1958, fully aware of the legal risks and social condemnation that awaited them in their home state. The long history of these laws also underscores the remarkable significance of the Lovings' Supreme Court case decades later. By challenging Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, they were not merely contesting a single statute. They were confronting a centuries-long tradition of legislated racial boundaries that had been reinforced across 38 states and embedded into the fabric of American society. The decision in Loving v. Virginia did more than legalize interracial marriage, it dismantled a historical architecture of oppression, invalidating not only a specific law, but also the legacy of countless statutes that had treated love as a conditional privilege rather than a fundamental human right. The story of Richard and Mildred thus gains even greater resonance when seen against this broader backdrop, illuminating the courage required to confront not just immediate legal restrictions, but a long-standing cultural and legal system designed to deny people the freedom to choose their partners, families, and lives. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that the Lovings' choice to marry was both an intimate and profoundly political act, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of systemic injustice. Their love emerged from a long continuum of legal and social control, yet it also represents the possibility of change, demonstrating that even laws deeply rooted in history can be challenged, questioned, and ultimately overturned when ordinary people assert their rights and humanity. By placing their personal story within the broader narrative of centuries of anti-miscegenation laws, we gain a deeper understanding of the social, legal, and cultural forces they confronted, and of the courage it took to defy them, reminding us that the pursuit of love and justice often requires confronting the weight of history itself. In the heart of the American South during the mid-20th century, Richard Loving and Mildred Getus's love faced obstacles that extended far beyond the rigid lines of law and the threat of legal punishment, reaching deep into the moral and religious beliefs that shaped entire communities. Many white evangelicals in the region considered interracial marriage not merely a social transgression, but a spiritual offense, a sin that violated the natural order ordained by God. Churches and clergy reinforced these convictions, preaching that racial separation was divinely mandated and that unions between people of different races were a threat to the sanctity of family. Community and faith itself. Sermons, church bulletins, and religious gatherings often echoed these messages, warning congregations that the blending of races would invite divine disfavor, moral decay, and social upheaval. Within this context, Richard and Mildred's desire to marry was seen as a direct affront not only to societal norms but to the perceived will of God, amplifying the stakes of their already perilous journey. From their earliest moments together, the couple had to navigate a world in which love was constantly judged through the lens of theology as well as law. Where neighbors, relatives, and even casual acquaintances might see their relationship as a violation of sacred principles. In Smalls, churchyards and local meeting halls were spaces where morality and law intertwined, shaping public opinion in ways that could isolate and intimidate those who dared challenge the status quo. For Richard and Mildred, simple gestures of affection, quiet conversations, or the decision to spend time together were imbued with social significance, each act carrying the potential for censure, rumor, and condemnation. Yet, in the face of these pressures, their bond deepened, strengthened not in spite of the opposition, but because of the courage required to sustain it in such a hostile environment. Every shared smile, every walk along the country roads, and every evening spent planning a future together became an assertion of their humanity and an act of quiet resistance against deeply ingrained religious and social dogma. The influence of evangelical beliefs extended into civic life, shaping not only personal attitudes but also the enforcement of laws and social customs. Local officials, juries, and judges often internalized these teachings, interpreting the statutes against interracial marriage not merely as legal mandates but as moral imperatives, giving religious justification to the penalties and exile that Richard and Mildred eventually faced. The fear of social reprisal, spiritual condemnation, and legal punishment created a suffocating atmosphere for interracial couples, making the decision to marry a matter of extraordinary courage. In this environment, the Lovings' choice to defy both church and state required a steadfast commitment to one another and a belief in the intrinsic rightness of their love, even when every authority figure around them seemed to insist otherwise. The moral opposition rooted in evangelical thought was not abstract. It had tangible effects on daily life. Families of mixed-race children often faced rejection from churches, denied baptisms, communion, and participation in religious rites. Social events, school functions, and community gatherings became arenas where prejudice was reinforced. Gossip spread, and individuals were ostracized for simply existing outside the accepted racial boundaries. In this way, religion became a mechanism of social control, intertwined with law and custom, which ensured that interracial unions were fraught with fear, uncertainty, and hostility. Richard and Mildred's experience illustrates how deeply these beliefs permeated communities, shaping the moral imagination of ordinary people and creating a climate where love was not only socially dangerous but morally suspect. Despite these pressures, the Lovings persevered, drawing on the quiet strength of shared values, mutual respect, and the certainty that their love was just. Their ability to withstand the spiritual, social, and legal opposition of their environment transformed their personal choice into a broader moral challenge, demonstrating that human compassion and understanding can confront entrenched religious and cultural prejudice. In doing, they exposed a profound tension between the dictates of institutional religion and the lived reality of human relationships, revealing the ways in which interpretations of divine law had been employed to justify inequality and restrict personal freedom. Their journey was a testament to the capacity of ordinary individuals to assert moral clarity, even in the face of long-standing cultural and spiritual norms that seemed immutable. The Lovings' eventual legal triumph, culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia, did more than secure the right to marry for one couple. It challenged a long history of religiously justified social control, setting a precedent that personal conscience and love could not be subordinated to imposed interpretations of morality. The story of their courage resonates today as a reminder of the human cost of religious and social orthodoxy when it is used to constrain fundamental freedoms. Through their persistence, Richard and Mildred demonstrated that the pursuit of justice and equality is inseparable from the pursuit of love, and that moral authority, when wielded to oppress rather than uplift, can and must be questioned. By navigating the intersection of faith, law, and personal desire, the Lovings revealed the profound power of love to challenge not only legal structures, but cultural and spiritual assumptions that had governed communities for generations. Their story illuminates how human resilience and conviction can transform personal experiences into catalysts for societal change, proving that the courage to love authentically can confront centuries of dogma, alter public perception, and expand the boundaries of justice. In the end, the Lovings' marriage was not simply a private union. It was a profound act of defiance against the forces of fear, prejudice, and religiously sanctioned exclusion, a lasting testament to the enduring strength of the human heart in the face of systemic opposition. As Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter navigated a world where love was policed by law, custom, and religion, an even more insidious force loomed in the background: the eugenics movement, a pseudo-scientific ideology that claimed to improve society by controlling human reproduction, often through caution, manipulation, and cruelty. In the United States, eugenics gained prominence in the early 20th century, intertwining with existing racial purity laws and providing a chilling justification for measures that targeted those deemed undesirable, including Black, Indigenous, and even poor white populations, who were considered socially or genetically defective. This ideology transformed ordinary bureaucratic practices into instruments of oppression, allowing state authorities to categorize, monitor, and manipulate citizens in the name of societal improvement, turning intimate human decisions into matters of public policy and racial control. The Lovings' struggle must be understood against this broader context, where love and family life were constantly surveilled and constrained by an ideology that claimed moral and scientific authority over the most personal aspects of existence. In Virginia, the eugenics movement directly influenced the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, the law that criminalized Richard and Mildred's marriage. Legislators and bureaucrats, inspired by the belief that racial mixing threatened societal purity, implemented policies that went far beyond simple legal prohibitions, requiring meticulous registration of racial identity, strict definitions of whiteness, and penalties for any deviation from the assigned racial category. The state actively enforced these laws, using public health offices, schools, and hospitals to monitor lineage and impose classifications, creating a climate in which even a trace of non-white ancestry could determine the course of a person's life. Limiting marriage, reproduction, and social mobility, eugenics provided a veneer of legitimacy to these actions, framing them not as acts of prejudice or discrimination, but as necessary interventions to protect society from genetic contamination, and in doing so, legitimized the systematic oppression of entire communities. Forced sterilizations were one of the most horrifying expressions of eugenics in action. Across the country, state institutions, including hospitals, psychiatric facilities, and prisons, were authorized to sterilize individuals deemed unfit, often without consent or full understanding of the procedure. Black and Indigenous women, as well as poor white women, were disproportionately targeted, their reproductive autonomy stripped away under the guise of scientific progress. These sterilizations were not isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated campaign to control the population, grounded in the same ideology that had inspired laws banning interracial marriage. The message was clear. Society had the authority to dictate who could reproduce, who could form families, and who could carry forward their lineage. Turning the most private human acts into instruments of state control, the Lovings' decision to marry, therefore, stood in stark contrast to a system that sought to constrain love and life itself according to racial and social hierarchies. The intertwining of eugenics and law also influenced medical and educational institutions, where professionals were encouraged to uphold racial purity and participate in the classification, sterilization, and suppression of marginalized populations. Physicians recorded racial ancestry on birth certificates. Schools limited access based on race, and hospitals implemented policies to monitor and intervene in family formation. This bureaucratic machinery created an environment in which Richard and Mildred's union was not only socially condemned but institutionally criminalized, and the pervasive ideology made it difficult for ordinary citizens to imagine challenging the system. Yet, the very extremity of these measures highlighted the courage required for interracial couples to assert their right to love and marry, transforming what might have been a private matter into a bold act of resistance against entrenched scientific, legal, and cultural authority. The eugenics movement's influence extended beyond Virginia. In Germany, similar ideologies inspired the Nazis' horrifying sterilization and extermination programs, demonstrating how scientific rationalizations for racial purity could manifest in systematic violence. In the United States, the legacy of forced sterilizations and anti-miscegenation laws created long-lasting social trauma, as entire communities were denied the right to form families, preserve their heritage, or live free from intrusive state intervention. The Lovings' experience thus reflects not only the immediate legal barriers they faced, but also the broader historical forces that sought to regulate human life itself, illustrating the intersection of law, ideology, and personal freedom. Against this backdrop, Richard and Mildred's love becomes profoundly revolutionary. Their marriage was an assertion of autonomy in the face of an ideology that dehumanized and controlled people based on ancestry, social status, and skin color. By choosing to unite despite the threats of legal punishment, social ostracism, and religious condemnation, they challenged a system that sought to define the boundaries of human relationships according to eugenic principles, demonstrating that personal dignity and love could triumph over the most deeply entrenched mechanisms of oppression. Their story illuminates the human capacity to resist structural injustice, highlighting the courage required to assert one's right to love, to marry, and to build a family free from state interference. Moreover, the Lovings' journey underscores the moral and ethical failures of eugenics, exposing the cruelty and absurdity of policies that sought to control reproduction and enforce racial hierarchies under the guise of science. Their courage laid the groundwork for a legal and social reckoning, culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Loving v. Virginia, which invalidated the Racial Integrity Act and struck a blow against laws grounded in eugenic ideology. The case serves as a testament to the resilience of human love against the machinery of oppression, reminding us that the fight for justice often requires confronting not only the letter of the law, but the insidious ideas and ideologies that underpin it. In the end, the story of Richard and Mildred Loving reveals how the intimate act of choosing a life partner can become a profound challenge to systemic injustice, showing that love and humanity can confront even the most pervasive and institutionalized forms of oppression, and that personal courage has the power to transform society, dismantling the structures built on fear, prejudice, and pseudoscientific reasoning. Long before Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter confronted the legal barriers to their marriage, The state of Virginia had already set a chilling precedent for the control of human life under the guise of public welfare. A precedent that would be most infamously embodied in the case of Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck was a young white woman whose life became a cautionary tale of how the eugenics movement, enmeshed with state power, could strip away fundamental human rights in the name of social improvement. Born in Charlottesville, Virginia, Carrie's early life was marked by hardship and vulnerability. She was placed in foster care after her mother was deemed unfit to care for her, and she grew up in an environment that offered little stability or protection. In 1924, as a teenager, she became pregnant as a result of sexual assault, a fact that was deliberately obscured in the legal proceedings that followed, highlighting the intersection of power, exploitation, and eugenideology in shaping her fate. The authorities at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, operating within a framework that claimed scientific legitimacy for social control, determined that Carrie Buck represented a genetic threat to society. Without her informed consent and with little regard for her personal rights, officials petitioned to sterilize her, arguing that her alleged feeble-mindedness made her unfit to reproduce. The courts moved swiftly, and ultimately, the case ascended to the United States Supreme Court in 1927 under the title Buck v. Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered the majority opinion, famously asserting that the sterilization of individuals like Carrie was a reasonable exercise of state power to protect society, a ruling that shockingly endorsed the removal of reproductive autonomy from vulnerable populations. The decision effectively legitimized a policy that targeted not only marginalized racial groups but also poor white citizens, demonstrating that the machinery of eugenics was impartial to color when it came to enforcing the ideology of genetic purity and societal fitness. Carrie Buck's case illuminates the broader social and legal landscape that would eventually entangle Richard and Mildred Loving, showing that state-sanctioned interference in matters of reproduction and marriage was not an abstract threat, but a lived reality for countless citizens. Eugenics in Virginia created a bureaucratic system that monitored, categorized, and controlled individuals, reducing human life to a set of characteristics deemed desirable or undesirable by those in power. This system allowed officials to interfere in the most intimate aspects of existence, determining who could bear children, who could marry, and who could participate fully in the fabric of society. The forced sterilization of Carrie Buck illustrates the human cost of these policies, highlighting how laws and scientific rhetoric were weaponized to reinforce social hierarchies and control bodies in ways that had devastating and lifelong consequences. Despite the oppressive environment, Carrie's story also underscores the limits of the legal system's moral reasoning and the dangers of accepting authority without scrutiny. The Supreme Court's endorsement of her sterilization reveals how judicial decisions perpetuate injustice when they are informed by ideology rather than compassion, and it provides a stark contrast to the later victories achieved by the Lovings, where Carrie Buck's autonomy was stripped away under the banner of eugenics. Richard and Mildred's persistence to claim their right to marry represents a counter-narrative, the assertion of personal dignity, love, and freedom in the face of systemic oppression. Their struggle highlights the tension between the state's desire to enforce conformity and the human impulse to form authentic connections, a struggle that echoes through both Carrie Buck's tragedy and the Lovings' courage. The broader implications of Buck v. Bell also reveal the intersection of law, science, and morality in early 20th century America. Eugenics provided a scientific veneer to deeply prejudiced social hierarchies, allowing legislators, medical professionals, and bureaucrats to justify actions that today are recognized as gross violations of human rights. Carrie Buck, a white woman without racial difference, was still subjected to these controls, showing that the eugenics movement's reach extended beyond race to encompass class, intelligence, and perceived social value. In this way, The sterilization laws were both a reflection and reinforcement of a society deeply invested in controlling bodies, dictating social order, and limiting personal freedoms, and they set a legal and cultural context in which Richard and Mildred's challenge to anti-miscegenation laws would become not only a fight for their love but also a broader assertion of human rights against intrusive state power. Carrie Buck's life did not end with her sterilization. She went on to marry, live quietly, and navigate the world as best she could under the shadow of a court ruling that had irrevocably altered her reproductive future. Yet her story remains a powerful reminder of how the mechanisms of law and policy can perpetuate injustice, and how individual courage like that of the Lovings becomes essential to challenging entrenched systems. The forced sterilization of a vulnerable young woman in Virginia, sanctioned by the highest court in the land, provides historical context for understanding the stakes of Richard and Mildred's legal battle, illustrating the pervasive and often invisible ways in which personal freedoms were denied under the guise of science, morality, and social improvement. By situating the Lovings' fight for love against the backdrop of cases like Carrie Buck's, we can see a clear trajectory, from coercive control of reproduction to the assertion of individual rights, from institutionalized oppression to the pursuit of justice and equality. The narrative of Carrie Buck underscores the human consequences of ideological law, and the courage of Richard and Mildred Loving demonstrates how personal integrity and love can confront and ultimately overcome such systemic injustices. In connecting these histories, we witness the evolution of human rights in America and the enduring significance of challenging laws and policies that seek to dictate the most intimate and personal choices of individuals, showing that the struggle for justice often spans generations, touching every facet of human life. The journey of Richard and Mildred Loving from the quiet streets of rural Virginia to the steps of the United States Supreme Court is a story of courage, love, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the face of systemic oppression. A journey that would forever alter the legal and cultural landscape of the nation. After their wedding in Washington, where interracial marriages were legally recognized, the couple returned to their home state of Virginia, full of hope and expectation for a life together, only to be confronted by a legal system determined to police love and maintain rigid racial hierarchies. Their union, so ordinary in its desire for companionship and family, was rendered a criminal act under the state's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a law that had its roots in centuries of anti-miscegenation statutes, the ideology of eugenics, and the pervasive social belief in white supremacy. In 1958, mere weeks after returning home, Richard and Mildred were arrested in the middle of the night by local authorities. A stark reminder of how deeply the tentacles of law and ideology could reach into the private lives of ordinary citizens. The Lovings faced not just legal penalties, but the threat of exile from their own home, a punishment meant to intimidate and isolate them. And yet, this adversity ignited a profound determination to challenge the injustice they endured. Forced to leave Virginia under the threat of a 1-year prison sentence, the Lovings relocated to Washington, where they lived in exile from the community they loved and the families they held dear. The distance from home was both a physical and emotional burden, a daily reminder of the ways in which discriminatory laws could fracture the ordinary rhythms of life and impose suffering on those who dared to defy social norms. Yet even in this separation, the Lovings' commitment to one another did not waver, and their story caught the attention of civil rights advocates, including the American Civil Liberties Union, who recognized that their case represented more than just the plight of a single couple. It symbolized the broader struggle against institutionalized racial discrimination and the fight to ensure that the most basic human rights, love, marriage, and family, were protected under the Constitution. The legal battle that ensued was long, complex, and emblematic of the entrenched nature of racial prejudice in the United States. Initially, lower courts upheld the Racial Integrity Act, affirming the state's authority to restrict marriage along racial lines and reiterating the deeply rooted belief that interracial unions were a threat to social order. The Lovings, however, were undeterred, driven not by abstract legal principles, but by the simple and profound desire to live together as husband and wife without fear of incarceration or exile. Their attorneys framed the case as a fundamental question of personal liberty and equality under the law, arguing that marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, and that state interference based solely on the racial identities of the parties was unconstitutional. This framing was powerful not only because it spoke to the Lovings' lived experience, but also because it challenged the very foundations of the legal structures that had long upheld racial discrimination, forcing the courts to confront the human consequences of laws rooted in prejudice. The case ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court in 1967, a moment that would resonate far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Chief Justice Earl Warren, writing for a unanimous court, delivered a landmark opinion declaring that the freedom to marry is a fundamental right inherent to the liberty of the person, and that under the Constitution, the state could not prohibit a marriage solely because of the racial identities of those involved. The decision in Loving v. Virginia struck down all remaining anti-miscegenation laws across the United States, rendering them unenforceable and affirming the principle that love and commitment cannot be legislated by race. The court's reasoning emphasized both the personal and societal dimensions of marriage, recognizing that prohibiting interracial unions inflicted profound harm on individuals while perpetuating the ideology of racial superiority that had long underpinned social and legal systems. The ruling was not merely a legal victory. It was a moral and cultural turning point, challenging Americans to reconsider the ethical foundations of laws that had institutionalized racial discrimination for centuries. The significance of Loving v. Virginia extends beyond the immediate legal outcome. It served as a catalyst for cultural change, emboldening other couples to assert their right to marry across racial lines and prompting a broader reflection on the injustices embedded in American society. The Lovings themselves became symbols of quiet resilience, demonstrating that ordinary people could confront extraordinary obstacles when motivated by love, integrity, and a sense of justice. Their story also illuminated the interconnectedness of legal advocacy and personal courage, showing that meaningful societal change often emerges from the intersection of individual action and strategic legal challenge, where the human desire for dignity and equality meets the mechanisms of constitutional protection. Even after the Supreme Court decision, the Lovings faced the challenge of translating legal victory into lived reality, navigating lingering social prejudice and community resistance. Yet their triumph inspired a generation and left an indelible mark on the nation's understanding of civil rights. By asserting their right to love freely, Richard and Mildred not only reclaimed their own lives but also challenged deeply entrenched ideologies that had long sought to control the most intimate aspects of human existence. The story of their legal battle underscores the transformative power of courage in the pursuit of justice, revealing how the assertion of personal freedom can reverberate through society, dismantling oppressive structures and redefining the boundaries of equality. In reflecting on Loving v. Virginia, it becomes clear that the case is more than a historical milestone. It is a testament to the resilience of human love in the face of systemic injustice, a demonstration that ordinary individuals can confront entrenched legal and social barriers, and a reminder that the right to marry, like all fundamental rights, is inseparable from the dignity and autonomy of the human spirit. The Lovings' journey from arrest and exile to Supreme Court triumph illustrates how personal determination, guided by principles of equality and fairness, can overcome even the most entrenched forms of discrimination, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and shape conversations about civil rights, human dignity, and the enduring struggle for justice in America. Even after the historic Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia, which legally dismantled anti-miscegenation statutes nationwide, the struggle for social acceptance and equality was far from over, as entrenched prejudices lingered in communities, institutions, and hearts across the nation, revealing that legal victories alone cannot instantly erase centuries of discrimination. In states like Alabama, for example, anti-miscegenation clauses remained embedded in the state constitution long after they were rendered unenforceable by the Supreme Court. And it was not until the year 2000, over 3 decades later, that voters formally removed these discriminatory provisions through a constitutional amendment, demonstrating how the law and societal attitudes often move at different speeds, and how the vestiges of racial bias can endure despite formal legal change. The persistence of prejudice was evident in both overt and subtle ways, from local resistance to interracial marriages to the continued stigmatization of mixed-race families, underscoring that the Lovings' legal victory, while monumental, represented only one step in a longer journey toward equality and social justice. In the years following the Supreme Court's ruling, Richard and Mildred Loving returned to Virginia, hopeful that they could live openly as a married couple. Yet they still confronted the cautious curiosity, discomfort, and outright hostility of neighbors, local officials, and community members, a reminder that the cultural and emotional landscapes of racism are not as easily legislated away as the written statutes themselves, even as younger generations grew up in a more integrated and interconnected society. The shadows of past discrimination lingered in education, religious practice, and public discourse, shaping perceptions of interracial relationships and perpetuating stereotypes that were difficult to dismantle. Community events, schools, and local institutions sometimes became arenas of subtle conflict, where mixed-race couples encountered questions, whispered judgments, or social isolation, illustrating that the fight for dignity and acceptance extends beyond the courtroom and into the fabric of everyday life. The story of the Lovings also illuminates the tension between national legal authority and local social enforcement, showing that while the Supreme Court's decision established constitutional principles, it could not immediately transform deeply ingrained social norms or eliminate private acts of prejudice. In Alabama, for instance, public school events, prom dances, and community gatherings sometimes became flashpoints for the lingering enforcement of anti-miscegenation ideology. As administrators, teachers, and community leaders, shaped by decades of cultural bias, struggled to reconcile legal mandates with personal beliefs. These incidents reveal that the cultural work of dismantling prejudice requires sustained effort, education, and advocacy, highlighting the difference between codified rights and lived realities, and illustrating that legal recognition is only one component of a broader struggle for equality and social cohesion. Despite these ongoing challenges, the legacy of Richard and Mildred Loving provided a moral and symbolic foundation for social change, inspiring individuals, families, and communities to reconsider their own biases and embrace the principle that love transcends race. Their story became a touchstone for civil rights education, public discussion, and media representation, demonstrating how personal narratives can humanize abstract legal concepts and encourage empathy, reflection, and dialogue in communities still grappling with the residue of segregation and racial prejudice. Documentaries, books, and films chronicling the Lovings' courage and perseverance helped to embed their experience into the national consciousness, providing a shared reference point for understanding both the historical injustices of anti-miscegenation laws and the continuing work needed to achieve true equality. The gradual removal of anti-miscegenation clauses, culminating in Alabama's amendment in 2000, also underscores the complex interplay between law, politics, and public opinion, showing that legal victories must often be reinforced by civic engagement, voter participation, and societal education to translate into meaningful change. Generations of mixed-race families who had quietly lived in defiance of both social norms and remaining legal remnants were finally recognized as full participants in society, illustrating that social transformation is incremental, cumulative, and often contested, requiring not only the courage of those directly affected but also the willingness of communities to confront historical injustices and recalibrate collective values. The persistence of social prejudice after Loving v. Virginia also highlights how systemic bias can endure in institutions, such as schools, religious organizations, and local governments, long after the law mandates equality. And it reminds us that civil rights victories are not endpoints but catalysts for ongoing education, dialogue, and cultural evolution. Even as interracial couples increasingly gained visibility and acceptance, they frequently encountered lingering assumptions, discriminatory practices, and social isolation, making it clear that legal recognition, while crucial, must be accompanied by active efforts to shift hearts, minds, and social practices toward genuine inclusivity. Richard and Mildred Loving's journey, therefore, is not only a story of legal triumph but also a testament to resilience in the face of enduring social opposition, illustrating the interplay between law and society and the necessity of courage, persistence, and advocacy in achieving lasting change. Their experience reveals that social progress is rarely linear, that victories in courtrooms must be reinforced by ongoing cultural transformation, and that the legacy of individuals who confront injustice with dignity and love extends far beyond their immediate circumstances, shaping the moral and ethical framework of future generations. In reflecting on the decades following the Supreme Court's ruling, it becomes evident that the Loving's story continues to resonate precisely because it encapsulates both the promise and the limits of legal intervention in social life, showing that while laws can protect rights, they cannot automatically eradicate prejudice. The eventual removal of anti-miscegenation clauses, combined with the growing social acceptance of interracial marriages, represents the slow but essential process of aligning legal structures with evolving cultural norms, demonstrating that the pursuit of equality requires vigilance, education, and empathy alongside judicial action. The Loving's perseverance in the face of persistent social prejudice underscores the enduring importance of individual courage, the necessity of challenging societal biases, and the transformative power of love in reshaping both personal lives and the broader social landscape, offering a lasting example of how legal victories and human dignity can together drive progress toward justice and equality. The story of Richard and Mildred Loving stands as one of the most compelling reminders of the power of love to challenge deeply ingrained social and legal injustices, demonstrating that personal courage, commitment, and resilience can have far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond the individuals directly involved. Their journey, which began in a small rural town in Virginia and culminated in a landmark Supreme Court decision, is not merely a tale of a couple fighting for their right to be together. It is a story of humanity confronting prejudice, of ordinary people asserting extraordinary moral courage in the face of systemic oppression. When Richard, a white, and Mildred, a woman of African American and Native American descent, dared to marry, they challenged not just a law but the social and cultural foundations of a society that had long sought to define relationships, worth, and freedom along rigid racial lines. Their willingness to assert their right to love freely highlighted the gap between what the law permitted, what society expected, and what justice demanded, and in doing so, they forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, discrimination, and the arbitrary barriers erected by prejudice. Through the Loving's struggle, the United States was compelled to examine the human cost of anti-miscegenation laws, revealing how legal structures had historically intruded into the most intimate aspects of personal life, policing who could marry whom and dictating the terms of love based on race. Their legal battle culminated in the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which struck down anti-miscegenation laws across the nation and affirmed that marriage is one of the fundamental liberties protected by the Constitution, a freedom that cannot be denied on the basis of race. Yet the importance of their story extends far beyond the courtroom. It lies equally in the personal courage they exhibited, the integrity with which they faced harassment and exile, and the quiet, steadfast commitment to each other that allowed them to endure social ostracism and legal intimidation. Their love became both a shield and a catalyst, protecting them in the moment and sparking change that would ripple through society for generations to come. In the decades following the Supreme Court ruling, the Loving story continued to resonate. Inspiring books, documentaries, and feature films that chronicled not only their personal journey, but also the broader historical and social context of racial discrimination and civil rights in America. These cultural works serve to preserve their legacy, educate new generations about the struggles faced by interracial couples, and foster dialogue about the ongoing challenges of prejudice, equality, and human dignity. Historical markers, museum exhibits, and educational programs have further cemented their place in the national consciousness, ensuring that the courage and determination displayed by Richard and Mildred are neither forgotten nor diminished by the passage of time. Their lives exemplify the profound impact that individual action can have in shaping the moral and ethical contours of society, showing that the choices of ordinary people can challenge entrenched systems of injustice and inspire collective reflection and reform. The Loving story also highlights the intersection of law, society, and culture, reminding us that while landmark legal decisions can dismantle institutionalized barriers, the work of changing hearts, minds, and everyday practices is ongoing. Even after the Supreme Court's ruling, social prejudice and resistance to interracial marriage persisted in some regions, illustrating that true equality requires not only legal protection but also cultural transformation, education, and the active engagement of communities to dismantle bias and embrace inclusion. In this sense, the Loving's legacy is not static. It is a call to action, an invitation for each of us to examine our own beliefs, challenge injustice where we encounter it, and uphold the dignity and rights of every individual, regardless of race, background, or circumstance. Their story embodies a universal truth: that love, when coupled with courage and conviction, can transcend even the most rigid societal constraints, illuminating the path toward justice, empathy, and equality. As we reflect on Richard and Mildred Loving, we are reminded that the impact of personal courage extends beyond the individual, shaping the lives of countless others who follow in their footsteps, asserting their rights, and challenging discrimination wherever it arises. Their story serves as an enduring symbol of hope, demonstrating that love and justice are not merely abstract ideals but lived experiences that require action, resilience, and a willingness to confront adversity with integrity. By celebrating their legacy through media, scholarship, and public memory, society continues to honor not only the Lovings themselves, but also the countless individuals who have faced similar struggles, reinforcing the principle that the fight for equality is ongoing and that every act of courage contributes to a more just and compassionate world. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the remarkable journey of Richard and Mildred Loving. If you found their story inspiring, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate courage, justice, and the transformative power of love. Your support helps us continue to share these important narratives and ensures that the lessons of history remain accessible to all. As you reflect on the Loving's legacy tonight, remember that love, integrity, and perseverance can challenge even the most entrenched barriers, and that each of us has the power to contribute to a world shaped by fairness, dignity, and respect. Good night, and may your own actions be guided by the courage and compassion exemplified by Richard and Mildred Loving.